Okay, next, verbal persuasion. Now, this is exactly what it says, encouragement or social support. Now, those things that affect the persuasive ability are things like the position of the persuader, the relationship to the individual, etc. So, for example, a coach, a behavioral coach or a life coach, may have more status or more influence as a persuader than, say, for example, your neighbor or someone that you don't know and just come across at a grocery store or something. And so, parent or peers or teachers or physicians is actually a very good example. Maybe people who would have more influence as a persuader in their ability to improve or increase your self-efficacy. So if your physician says to you, John, I think, well, in fact, I feel that you can quit smoking. It's time for you to quit smoking, and I know you can do it. So here's what I'd like you to do. Well, that improves your self-efficacy if you're like most people. Someone with a position of a certain amount of prestige or influence provides you or bolsters your self-efficacy. Situation. And this is something we're going to talk about in just a minute when we talk about somatic and emotional states. So, for example, what type of mental condition are you in? Are you stressed out? Are you going through a divorce? Are you financially hurting? In which case, if we say something like, "Hey, I know you can quit smoking," well, it may be that your situation is is not conducive to actually changing behavior. Now, intervention implications. What does this mean for me in my own work? Well, I think it's important to recognize that the position of the persuader, or whomever is trying to persuade us verbally, that they are cognizant and aware of the priorities of the local culture. So, for example, and we see this very frequently, where interventionists, who are very different from the person whose behavior we're trying to change, would, in some cases, provide verbal persuasion that might be perceived as just like blowing steam, for example, to use a term that I think really captures what I'm trying to say. So, for example, you might have, in a racial or ethnically very diverse community, you might have, let's say, for example, you have a Caucasian or a white health educator go into East Los Angeles, where it would be predominantly Hispanic, and say things like, "Hey, I know you guys can start exercising and you can reduce these high rates of diabetes in this community and obesity and so on and so forth." Well, that person might be perceived as idealistic if they're not just completely ignored altogether. And so sometimes we'll use what we call promotores or lay health advisors. These would be people who are from the community, who might share the same racial or ethnic characteristics. They might have the same demographics in terms of income and age and gender and so on and so forth. And we call them lay health advisors because we provide them just a very minimal amount of education related to the behavior, and we teach them how to provide this verbal persuasion or encouragement or social support. Here's an example of verbal persuasion.
I'm pretty scared. You can defeat him, Panda. Are you kidding? If they can't, they're 5 masters. I'm just one me. But you will have the one thing that no one else does. You really believe I'm ready? You are. Poe.
Okay, now consider, for example, and obviously this is a funny example, but consider, for example, if the master were a physician, and if he were saying something like, "I believe that you're ready to quit smoking." A position of influence, very sincere and genuine, and it's quite likely that that will, in fact, we know from a lot of research that that will improve and increase self-efficacy. Okay, lastly, somatic and emotional states. Now, you might think this is obvious, but it's important to consider when we're engaging in interventions and behavior change programs that we aren't expecting too much, considering the stress and emotional conditions that some people may be facing. So, for example, stress and anxiety and worry, these all affect self-efficacy. So if you look at the average smoker that wants to quit smoking, and if you ask them, why are you not quitting, or have you tried to quit, and oftentimes what you'll see is they'll report things like, I'm going through a divorce, we're losing our home, I just lost my job, or there's a lot of stress at work, or I'm starting a new relationship, or it's finals week. Whatever condition they're reporting about, it oftentimes involves a lot of stress and anxiety and worry. When people are under those conditions, it influences their self-efficacy. They're not able to invest as much energy and emotion into behavior change. Very common, we see what we'll call a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is people that say, I don't think I can quit smoking. I don't think I can quit smoking. I don't think I can quit smoking. And then they'll try, and because they didn't have very high self-efficacy, they fail. And when they fail, they say, see, I told you. I told you that I couldn't quit. And their self-efficacy is further decreased by the embarrassment and the realization that, in fact, I couldn't quit when I knew that I couldn't. So, intervention implication. What do we do? Well, the obvious thing is that we need to be, the first thing is we need to reduce these somatic and emotional states. So to the extent that we can reduce stress and anxiety, or perhaps teach them behaviors, coping behaviors, for dealing with stress and anxiety and worry. The other thing is just very practical and logical, and maybe that is that we don't expect too much right now. Or we don't try and do too much, or try and accomplish too much, or maybe we wait a couple of weeks or months until there's less stress or anxiety in their lives. So here's kind of the model for self-efficacy theory. So those that would be successful, and let's say, for example, the example we're going to use here is for quitting smoking. Successful attempts at quitting smoking would be those where there's very low somatic or emotional interference, meaning there's not a lot of stress or anxiety. There's a high vicarious experience. They've seen a father, an uncle, a brother, a friend be successful at quitting smoking. Verbal persuasion, perhaps from a spouse, perhaps from children, perhaps from a physician that says, we know you can quit smoking, we're here to support you. Mastery experience. We've provided him or her with opportunities to be successful, perhaps in the short term at quitting smoking. So say, for example, we'll say, we'd like you to quit smoking for 1 day. And then you can smoke after that 1 day. And then next week, we want you to quit smoking for 2 days. So we're progressively putting them in situations that are getting a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, we're giving him or her an opportunity to be successful. And these, to the extent that all of these are in order, it's likely to result in a successful attempt at quitting smoking, which we would conclude based on the theory that it's the result of high self-efficacy. Those are on the left side. And of course, the opposite of those would be on the right-hand side, where there's a decrease in mastery experience, low vicarious experience, no verbal persuasion, and a lot of stress, anxiety, and worry. These are just more examples that I shared with you at the beginning of this discussion about, could you run 10 miles? Could you run 1 mile? And these are just examples of measures of self-efficacy.